I was wondering about the responsibility again. But being clear about what one is responsible for. So are you responsible for the... Well, I'm saying that you're not responsible for the arising of the possibilities for acting out of greed, lust or delusion. So you're not... So there's always there's a possibility that you can act out of lust, but you're not responsible for that arising of that possibility.
Exactly. That's on the level of Mara. When Mara throws these options at you, hey, why don't you do this? Or hey, look at that. Why are you doing? Go over there. But you choosing to accept and act, that's on you. Mara cannot make you do that. That's why you will never even... Well, you're never going to see where the line for your responsibility is if by default you're refusing to accept it even for the obvious things.
Because by accepting the possibility that I can go and have sexual intercourse, therefore I must.
Yeah, exactly.
Therefore, hey, that's just... I can't suppress
so then the
things.
only way for you to not do that is to ignore that possibility is there. I mustn't think about these possibilities because I will be unable to restrain myself.
Right.
Now you have to do that in the beginning, perhaps, until you sort of increase mental strength. But you have to recognize that you must deal with it eventually, with the fact that these possibilities will always remain.
Right.
And they were never the problem. The problem was that you could not help but act out of it. Oh, I just can't restrain from saying something when I get irritated. Well, actually you can. The only reason you can't is you keep choosing to say it. But if you start recognizing that it's not about not having an option to say something or not having an option to do something, it's about not being able to resist that pressure of saying something or doing something.
That's the problem.
That's the problem, yeah. But if you don't know, well, if you never look at, like, say, an option to say something out of irritation, you never stop and look at it. You either just say it or try to remove the option, and thus I will remove the pressure of having to say something. Now that's overstepping. Now you're again going into Mara's domain, either through overly accepting what he has to offer you as an option, or overly denying and trying to tell him not to offer you that as an option because you can't help yourself. Oh, please don't even tempt me. Well, that's not on you to decide. Temptations are there because you keep giving in to them.
Yeah, temptations are a problem because you keep giving into them. You keep choosing them.
You keep choosing them. So now you recognize that temptations are the problem, but you can't stop choosing them. So now you try to prevent Mara from tempting you, which it means you react to his temptations again.
Yeah.
You made a problem out of that which it isn't.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. If you accept that, if your rule of thumb is to accept responsibility for your choices, even if you're unclear about it, you lean on to, well, it's probably on me, not because of this or this. You will stop blaming circumstances, including other people or whatever else, for your choices. And you will also stop blaming Mara for presenting you with those choices or presenting you with limited, because sometimes people complain they don't have enough choices. Thus, they're not responsible for what they choose on account of limited choices. No, choice is a choice. As such, you're responsible for choosing it. Doesn't matter whether the content of that choice is great or limited, fortunate, unfortunate, doesn't matter. What matters is that you choose it. Yes, circumstances are different for different people. That's how it works. But the fact is that regardless of the circumstances, whether they're favorable choices, agreeable choices, disagreeable, limited choices, I only had offers of bad choices. Still, responsibility for choosing is on you. You're not absolved by responsibility. It doesn't matter how bad choices Mara have presented you with. And that's the nature of existence. But for as long as you feel justified in what you've chosen, because the choices were limited, the choices were bad, the choices were not as good as for other people, you're ignoring where responsibility is, and that's why you are basically trapped by Mara. Not because choices were bad or choices were good, it's because you don't see where the line is, so you wander, as the Buddha would say, into the hunter's trap, not knowing that that's a trap.
Right.
Not knowing this is the line, if I cross, I'll get trapped. That's the noose. And if I stay outside of it, he can't trap me.
Yeah.
I can go around it.
Right, so the entry point is your choice.
Ignoring that you're responsible for your choice, regardless of the circumstances. And that's for many people, it's a hard pill to swallow because, it's not like easier. It's not consciously done, but it's kind of natural response of an ignorant mind is to, oh well, I've chosen that because of this or because of that, not because also you perceive difference in people's choices, difference in people's circumstances, and there's if only I had these options, I would not have chosen what I've chosen. I would have chosen better, and so on. And that's probably true, but it's beside the point. The point is, doesn't matter what options there are, doesn't matter what choices you made, you will be responsible for your choices, and that's the heavy weight of that recognition.
Choices that you make, yeah.
Choices that you make, yeah. That's the heavy weight of the recognition of beings are owners of their karma. Karma literally is a choice, and an action that comes out of the choice. So your choice is already an action. So you realize, that's what the Buddha meant by, really contemplate that, because it's only on you, and you will be bound with the results of it. Doesn't matter what choices you had, that's all pre you acting on account of the choices. But once you do, that's on you. In other words, there's never an excuse to act out of greed, aversion, delusion. It doesn't matter what circumstances you were presented with to act upon.
These were my most pressing choices, so to speak.
Yeah. And another thing is that's why you cannot just step outside of that karma, that basically being condemned to choose. You cannot step outside of it simply by choosing this on account of this, because you still are bound to choice. Yeah, you can choose better, you can choose worse. Choosing non-greed, non-aversion, non-delusion is better than greed, aversion, delusion, but in itself, it still keeps you bound to that pressure of choice. And that's the whole point of, you cannot possibly not choose. If you say, I will not choose any of this, you choose that. And that might be the right choice, if all the other choices are bad. But still, it's within the choice. That's why, you cannot, in order to step outside to basically free yourself from karma and pressure of it and samsara and everything, all the implications of your choices and results, you need to become an arahant. You need to fully uproot the slightest craving, the slightest holding onto things and so on, in order to then truly be free from that burden of choice.
But you can do it by choosing.
The necessary basis for developing that is to choose non-greed, non-aversion, non-delusion, regardless of the circumstances. Again,
but there
is never I didn't have the fortunate options to choose, so I had to choose greed, aversion, delusion. No, that's choice of greed, aversion, delusion, or choice of non-greed, non-aversion, non-delusion is always internal, regardless of the circumstances. But again, if you if you're ignoring responsibility of that internally, you will by default project the same attitude externally. In other words, everything will be everyone else's fault, or the fault of the impersonal. If I only have lived in a better culture, or if only I live in a better state, or in a better society, or a better family. It's never on you, because internally you're unable to accept it. As a result of it, you just keep mirroring the same attitude elsewhere.
But it should be actually quite a liberating insight.
After you deal with the fright of it,
right,
it's liberating, yes. But you need to be basically courageous enough to accept that weight, anxiety of responsibility. So literally, things are not in my control. Options that are presented to you are not in your control. Yet, if I choose them, it's on me. If I don't choose them, it's on me. If I abstain from choice, well, that's another choice. Postponing the choice is what I choose. Everything is on me. Hence, oh my goodness, beings are owner of their actions. Like when people will recognize that in the suttas. This is inescapable. Whether I go or stay back or both or neither, I am under it. how do I escape this? And that's where the Buddha's teaching come into play.
So you're saying there can be initial fear, like, whoa,
It's going
I'm
to be frightening,
responsible,
yeah.
but then
Yeah.
I'm responsible.
Means, so you're not subjected to chance anymore.
Yeah, I
or
can
rather,
decide.
your well-being
Yeah.
is not dependent on chance anymore,
Exactly,
because
exactly.
you recognize well-being is basically on the level of that, like, emotional background of your choices.
Yeah.
And if you're responsible for your choices, then you will be responsible for the result of those choices, which is that emotional background. So that's why the Buddha would say a man who sort of recognizes, I should act for my own welfare and welfare of others.
Yeah.
He's the one who will not neglect that, because you realize that's what welfare comes from. My well-being, my welfare is by not choosing things upon greed, aversion, delusion.
Yeah.
Has to have proved that. Yeah. So even if you stick to it and if you don't develop greater wisdom, you're still going to have greater welfare.
Yeah.
Internally, than if you just blindly choose and follow aimlessly towards whatever's thrown at you. I want this, I don't want that.
Yeah.
And even then, by the way, you have a criteria. You choose to be the criteria. You can start questioning as to, why do I always choose pleasure? Why do I always choose to resist pain? There must be some reason for that. It's natural. Yeah, but what is the natural reason for it? It's basically how I feel. So the sole governing power of my whole existence, my values, my actions, the results of it, everything else I have to bear on account of it is simply my feelings, how I feel at the time. Could I perhaps say no to how I feel? Yeah. You can't say no to there isn't feeling, but you can say no to acting out of it, because that's another option, see? So you don't need to act towards pleasure. You don't need to act away from pain, but that takes training. That's why with the grain of an ignorant mind and against the grain of the mind that developed wisdom.
But the result, if you're going in that right direction, can only be the right result.
Can only be the result of
going in the right direction.
A beneficial result.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the literally kusala means beneficial. Akusala is non-beneficial.
Yeah.
And
unbeneficial.
Unbeneficial, yeah. And kusala means beneficial for you, and by proxy then for everybody else. Because if your mind is free from greed, aversion, delusion, you cannot possibly be perpetuating that towards others.
Yeah.
Or instigating it in others. So it's a win-win for everyone if everybody would individually start accepting responsibility, not just for things they do, but things they contemplate doing. So for your own basically action by mind, speech and the body, for your choices. So if you choose something, it's not like, okay, so I will not choose. That's impossible. That's your choice. So you want to know the reason behind your choices, means basically that's how you prevent obscuring your responsibility behind your choices. This is chosen, and I mean like, I've chosen this because he said such and such, so I've done this. No. He said such and such, and I chose that to be the reason for me acting like this.
Yeah.
And then so how did I act then on account of me choosing that to be the reason for my action? Well, I acted with greed, I acted with aversion, there's no justification for that. Now, if you remove greed, aversion, delusion as a motivation for your action, then you can say, no, he said that, and I acted like this without greed, without aversion, without delusion. So you're not blameworthy for acting in this manner and not acting in that manner. Certain things, yes, killing, stealing, cheating, lying, that's always blameworthy.
No.
But other things are blameworthy if rooted in greed, aversion, delusion, and not blameworthy if they're not rooted in those very things. So there's no like, I must always act like this. No, I must always not act out of greed, aversion, delusion. Doesn't matter particularly what I might do on account of it.
Yeah.
I did not speak softly enough. Doesn't matter. Was it rooted in greed, aversion, delusion? Yes, then it matters. But not because whether you've spoken softly or not. It's because it was rooted in greed, aversion, delusion. Irritation, lust, ignoring, basically indolence, and so on.
So if you do that long enough, that training, not acting out of greed, hatred, delusion, then if you get used to that, or you're in terms of you're incapable of acting out of greed, hatred, delusion, you still have the option. The option's always there, presented by Mara.
Yes,
But you're no longer pressured by
for a period of time. In other words, Mara will keep presenting you with options for as long as there is a chance that you will choose them, that you will act out upon them. But if you have been steadfast long enough, and that there is no set time, this is how long it has to be. It depends on people. But individually is determined how long you need to be steadfast. But if you are steadfast long enough, Mara will stop. Mara will leave you. He'll stop even presenting, entertaining the option. And that's when the Buddha says in the suttas, after his enlightenment, Mara followed him for 7 years, trying to find an opening like a crow, trying to get something to bite on. And then he gave up, because he realized, oh, this is steadfast. There is absolutely no coming back towards that which I can, bait people with and so on. And then he left it. So that's what I mean. And there is a similar sutta where it says, like, the flies will be sort of flying around where they can still perceive something worth landing on. But even when everything is cleaned, all the impurities are gone, the flies will still be around because there's a habit of hanging around and landing on something. Until long enough there hasn't been anything offered for them to land on, and they leave. They'll find somebody else.
Yeah, so let's say the Arahant, he can't kill anyone, but if there's a gun and there's someone, some criminal attacking someone else, that option of taking a gun and shooting a criminal, for example, just
as a thought, I suppose it's there.
That's a possibility in the world, but for him,
it's impossible
to choose that. He can't.
It's impossible.
He can't be pressured in any way to choose that. So that's what I mean. Yeah. That those possibilities.
Yeah, but there are no possibilities in the world independent of individuals. Every possibility is on the basis of individual experience. So talking abstractly about possibilities in the world, it's only applicable based on the individual. In other words, you can't talk abstractly about it. So is the person free from greed, aversion, delusion? Motion of picking up the gun and shooting somebody, killing them, is a possibility.
So saying the meaning of those things have gone.
The necessary basis for those things is removed. So that's why the Buddha would make those declarations like Arahant is incapable of, such thing is impossible to occur in universe of all the eons and realms. It's impossible for such and such to occur. For Sotapanna, it's impossible to take anybody else as a teacher in the Buddha. It's impossible. And if you still think abstractly of these possibilities independent of individuals, you might think, well, how is that impossible for him to take somebody else's teaching? But if you realize there is no such thing as abstract possibilities independent of individuals, there's there has to be a basis: ignorance or non-ignorance, aversion or non-aversion, lust or non-lust. And person has uprooted that. Oh, it's impossible for anybody else, for such person to follow any different teaching. So certain things require certain basis of greed, aversion, ignorance to be acted upon, to be maintained. Once these things are gone, it's inconceivable for those things to be done, which means that's when those possibilities will cease for those people. So there is no possibility for an Arahant to commit murder, or sexual intercourse for that matter. It's impossible.
So the meaning of that object and...
Well, that's the thing. Objects are known through the meaning. But usually, yes, people would kind of get the meaning on account of the objects. But if you have fully understood the nature of it, you realize the meaning is that which determines it, and that's how objects are known as objects.
So a gun.
So yeah, a meaning, like he might use a gun to, hammer a nail or something, but he better put a safety on. He will not have he can even have a memory. If he used to shoot people for whatever reason, like Angulimala, he didn't have a gun, but say he did.
Yeah, no.
So he has a memory of using this to commit murder, but the significance, the context of it, the meaning of killing, it's impossible for him to do that. That's why, again, it's all determined by the intention. There were those cases in the suttas when a monk accidentally sat on those, like a big seat with many cushions, and there's a baby underneath sleeping, and he killed it, completely unintentional. And the Buddha made the rule: you need to lift up things basically before you sit down. So that was his fault, not killing. His fault was not checking, so he was carelessly just threw himself back on this seat.
Yeah.
And he might have well been an arahant. So that's not killing. Killing is determined by the intention to take away the life.
Yeah.
And that intention is impossible for him. Because you cannot have that intention without a degree of aversion or lust or ignorance, which he has completely uprooted. So that's where that kind of mundane sense of responsibility is the place to start, and never abandon it. Just cultivate it more and more.
But you need to get beyond that fear and into the recognition that this is a great position.
Yes, because once people start recognizing that responsibility, anxiety comes, and then you can sort of get like a choice paralysis, so to speak, like whatever I do, but then you realize, well, that is your choice now as well. Abstaining from these choices because you can't bear the weight of it.
Yeah,
like, well, no, you have to actually accept it and endure it, endure the unpleasantness of it, and recognize that that's your choice as well.
But get the results.
If you persist, you will have to get the results. Yeah.
So,
because in order to keep ignoring responsibility, that attitude, you need to keep maintaining it. You need to keep acting out of ignoring responsibility. You need to keep maintaining the views that you are not responsible. It's someone else's fault, circumstances, lack of fortune,
right.
Or when people say, maybe in the next life, and I don't have enough paramis in this life. How could you possibly know that? You just decided that as an excuse. So you chose that to be an excuse for abstaining from, for avoiding responsibility of your own choices. In other words, you're responsible for basically keeping yourself in the state of non-responsibility, which is greed, aversion, delusion.
Yeah.
And you cannot possibly be cultivating sense of responsibility without a mindfulness, without composure, without, carefully attending to what you're choosing, what you're thinking, what you're going to say.
Being mindful of your
you have to.
responsibility.
Yeah. So if you're responsible, you're mindful. If you're mindful, you'll be aware of responsibility.
Yeah.
In other words, you have no excuses, because an excuse, you're responsible for it. Arahant is the only being, you could call it, that is excuse-free. Completely. He's free. He doesn't need any excuse. He's completely free from any blame, any excuses. Actually, what they called it, didn't they? Blameless, the blameless one. There's nothing there that can be a basis for blame. Doesn't mean people won't blame him, because ignorant people obviously will perceive things to be blamed which are not blameworthy in themselves. But internally speaking, which is the only measure, he is blameless. So it's excuse free. He needs no excuses for anything.
It simplifies things as well.
In a way, yes, but if, the simple context doesn't mean it's easy. It means it's maybe, less sort of proliferated, maybe it's less defined, less elaborated on, which kind of, for some people, might make it even harder to grasp. But either way, whichever way you arrive at it, it's going to require work of going against the grain of your existence, because that's the nature of the trap. Slide in effortlessly. If a trap requires you work to get in, nobody would get trapped. Same. You want to catch a mouse, you put peanut butter in that humane trap. You won't just go in it. I mean, sometimes they're really, really dumb or something, but even then. So trap needs to be effortless. So what is the effortless in this life? Acting out of sensuality is effortless. Acting out of aversion when you're angry, it's effortless. Acting out of indolence towards indolence, thinking too much, too painful, making that effort of grinding against the grain, it's I'll go with least resistance. Means I go with the grain. Means that's why you're blameworthy. That's why you're subject to suffering. That's why you're subject to samsara. Not because of the choices or the lack of them. that you might have experienced. I didn't have many opportunities. You're alive, you're breathing, your senses are intact, you have more opportunity than you need. So the only person who would say, but even then the Buddha would say they're responsible, is the one, born blind, deaf, undeveloped, incapable of rational thought. But even then, they're not born like that by chance. Okay, the Buddha says that you have to take it on faith. They're born like that because of the previous things they've done. And you could see that, if in this life you recognize that every choice you make, every intentions you act upon, results will have to be bound with you. Then you realize, if I was born short, ugly, sick or something, it's probably the choices I was making in the past. I have no memory of it. But based on the principle that I can understand here and now, this is no different.
Yeah. It's probably my fault.
Well, even if you don't necessarily think it's my fault, doesn't matter what you were born with. What matters is what you do with it, in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, even if you're, not as good as others around you, it's irrelevant. Those things are not the measure. The measure is what you do. Whether you keep perpetuating greed, aversion, delusion, or you don't perpetuate greed, aversion, delusion. So in other words, just by being born as a human, you're already more than fortunate enough to deal with samsara. It's the best realm. It's impossible to deal with samsara if you're born as an animal, and it's virtually impossible to deal with samsara if you're born as a deva or higher, because it's just too pleasant. There's no issues that you see. So human realm is the perfect balance of pain and pleasure for you to start reflecting on both, which is a necessary basis for uprooting the whole samsara. But you need to start taking responsibility for what you think, what you choose. Because if you don't, you're blaming the pain or blaming the pleasure for your craving towards pain, towards pleasure, or craving away from pain. That's in the nutshell boils down to that. For as long as there is a degree of avoiding responsibility, means your craving will be justified by how you feel. Yeah. There is no justification for craving. So feeling is not on you. Pleasure is not on you. Pain is not on you. Neutral feeling is not on you. Craving towards pleasure, craving away from pain, craving basically ignoring the neutral is on you.
Yeah.
And there is no linear connection between feeling results in craving. No. Ignorance is the connection of feeling resulting in craving. Ignorance of feeling means craving. Stop ignoring the feeling, you will be incapable of craving.
So why do you crave for pleasure? Some people would say that because it's pleasant and that's what you do.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, but that's
people.
You crave because
people
you
who
crave.
Would say that are people who obviously haven't made the effort to understand the nature of pleasure, or at least think about it. Like, okay, so I choose pleasure because it's pleasant, but what is the reason for valuing the pleasure?
Because it's pleasant.
So what is the reason for me valuing that which is pleasant? Pleasure is, so what? Pleasure is a reason in itself? Means you will be completely unaware of it. You will just be blindly, you see a light, you fly into it. But no, you have choices. You have choices even on what pleasure you want. So you are involved there. So you can't say, it's just because of pleasure. Because if pleasure is automatically the reason for pleasure, it wouldn't require your thinking, choosing, acting, postponing to get more. Why do you do all of these reflections upon value of pleasure if pleasure is a value in itself? If pleasure is a value in itself, experiencing pleasure is self-contained fully. Why do you need more of it then? Because you're not feeling more pleasure, by the way, before you commit to sensuality. Yet you're seeking more pleasure on account of the pleasure right here, right now. So there must be some other reason involved between the pleasure you have and pleasure you want. Because if the pleasure you have is the reason for pleasure you want, you already have it. So you'll be craving free, sensuality free. In feeling, there will be just a feeling. But it isn't it? So saying pleasure is the reason for wanting pleasure, it's incorrect. You choose pleasure to be the reason for wanting more pleasure. So why do you choose that? Because you value pleasure. Why do you value pleasure? Because you're completely ignorant of its perilous nature. That's why the Buddha say contemplate danger, don't be negligent. Because it is truly dangerous. You don't know that. But if you take what the Buddha said on faith, and then actually start contemplating it, you get to see it, and then you realize, oh my goodness, I dodged a bullet here. Like the relief of attainments. Like pay the debt, freed from the prison, cross the desert, all the similes in jhanas, similar.
Mm-hmm.
The burden has been laid down, the duty, I don't need to do anything, I am free now.